Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. he heard it. A sound no one else seemed to notice. Not loud, not clear, but wrong. It wasn't the kind of noise you could easily explain away as pipes or wind or an old house settling. It had a pattern, a rhythm, almost like someone trying to say something without being heard. And the night it finally stopped, someone on that street vanished. His name was Joseph Walker, a 54-year-old widower who had lived on that quiet street in Ohio for nearly 2 decades. The kind of man who noticed small changes, who kept routines, who knew when something didn't belong. At first, he tried to ignore it, like most people would. A strange noise in the middle of the night doesn't usually mean anything until it does. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Joseph would wake up without fail at 2:17 a.m., not because he set an alarm, but because the sound would pull him out of sleep like a quiet alarm only he could hear. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss, like something shifting behind a wall or beneath the floor. But over the next few nights, it became harder to ignore. It repeated in short bursts, uneven, as if someone was tapping, then stopping, then starting again. He even walked through his house one night, checking pipes, vents, even stepping outside into the cold just to see if it was coming from somewhere else. But when he stepped out onto his porch, the street was silent. No cars, no movement, just that same sound, somehow clearer now, echoing faintly through the stillness. And that's when he realized it wasn't coming from his house at all. It was coming from next door. The house next door had only recently been occupied. A woman in her early 30s had moved in just a few weeks earlier. Her name was Sylvia Carter. She kept to herself, rarely spoke to anyone, but always smiled politely when she was seen. There was nothing outwardly unusual about her. No loud arguments, no late-night visitors, nothing that would make anyone suspect something was wrong. But Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The timing of the sound matched perfectly with the hours when the entire neighborhood was asleep. And it wasn't random. It was deliberate. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, he stood in his living room, staring at the wall that separated his house from hers, listening carefully as the sound came again. 3 short taps, pause, 2 more, then silence. It didn't feel like noise anymore. It felt like a message. He told himself he was overthinking it, that it was nothing, that calling the police over a faint, unexplainable sound would make him look paranoid. And for a few nights, he managed to convince himself of that. But then came the night everything changed. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the sound returned, but this time it was different. Louder, faster, urgent. It didn't stop after a few seconds like before. It kept going, repeating over and over again, as if whoever, or whatever, was making it was trying harder than ever to be heard. Joseph sat up in bed, his heart pounding, listening as the rhythm grew more chaotic. It wasn't controlled anymore. It sounded desperate. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Completely. No fading. No final tap. Just silence. The next morning, the street looked exactly the same as it always did. Sunlight poured over the houses, birds chirped, and neighbors went about their routines. But something was off. Sylvia's car was still in the driveway, but her curtains were drawn tight. By the afternoon, word began to spread quietly. No one had seen her. Calls went unanswered. By evening, the police were there, moving through the house, checking every room, every corner. No signs of forced entry. No obvious struggle. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Joseph watched from his window as officers moved in and out, his mind replaying the sounds from the night before. He hesitated, unsure if what he heard even mattered. But eventually, he stepped outside and told them everything. At first, it didn't seem like much to go on. A noise in the night. Something vague, something uncertain. But it was the only unusual detail anyone had. So the investigators listened. They asked questions. When exactly did it start? How often did it happen? Could it have been anything else? Joseph answered as best as he could, though even he wasn't sure what he had been hearing. Still, something about the consistency of it caught their attention. And that's when they decided to take a closer look. Not just inside the house, but beneath it. What they found would explain the sound, but it would raise even more questions than it answered. Was it a cry for help, or something far worse? Why didn't anyone else hear it? And more importantly, why didn't he call the police sooner? Those were the questions that would quietly settle over that street long before anyone realized just how serious this situation had become. Because the truth is, Joseph Walker had asked himself those same questions over and over again in the days leading up to Sylvia Carter's disappearance. He had stood in his kitchen at night, staring at the wall between their homes, listening carefully, trying to convince himself that what he was hearing didn't mean anything, that it wasn't his responsibility, that there had to be a simple explanation. But deep down, there was a part of him that knew better, a part that recognized the pattern, the timing, the persistence of that sound, and understood that it didn't belong in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The investigators would later focus on that hesitation, not because Joseph had done anything wrong, but because sometimes the smallest delays can change everything. They wanted to know exactly what he heard, how often he heard it, and why it hadn't been reported sooner. And Joseph, sitting there trying to recall each detail, each night, each moment he chose to ignore it, began to realize that what seemed insignificant at the time might have been the only warning anyone was ever going to get. Because whatever Sylvia had been trying to communicate through that wall, it had been happening before she disappeared, not after. And by the time anyone started asking the right questions, the only thing left behind was silence, and a house that no longer felt like just another home on the street. The street Joseph Walker had called home for nearly 20 years was the kind people trusted without thinking twice. A place where mornings began with sprinklers ticking across green lawns and evenings ended with porch lights glowing softly as neighbors waved goodnight. A place where children rode their bikes in slow circles and nothing ever seemed out of place. The kind of street where you believed things like this simply didn't happen. Families knew each other by name. Small talk carried easily across driveways, and doors were often left unlocked without fear. When Sylvia Carter moved in just a few weeks earlier, she slipped into that rhythm almost unnoticed, polite when spoken to, quiet most of the time, offering a brief smile that never quite lingered long enough for anyone to ask more. She was, by every outward measure, ordinary, the kind of neighbor you could live beside for years without ever really knowing. But Joseph noticed something, not at first in the way she spoke or carried herself, but in the silence that surrounded her house once the sun went down, a silence that didn't feel empty, but held something just beneath it, something that didn't belong. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., that sound would come again, faint at first, barely there, like a distant tapping that could almost be dismissed if you weren't paying attention, but Joseph was paying attention. It repeated in a way that didn't feel accidental, uneven yet intentional, as if there was meaning behind it, something trying to break through but falling just short. He found himself listening for it even before it started, lying awake some nights, waiting, anticipating the moment it would return, and when it did, it carried that same strange urgency, quiet but persistent, almost desperate, like someone reaching out without being seen, without being heard, and with each passing night, the feeling grew stronger that whatever was happening inside Sylvia Carter's house wasn't as simple as it appeared from the outside. Then one night, it changed. Joseph Walker would later remember that moment with a clarity that felt almost cruel, the way certain memories refuse to fade no matter how much time passes. He had already been awake, lying still in the dark, waiting without admitting to himself that he was waiting, when the sound came again at exactly 2:17 a.m. But this time, it wasn't faint, and it wasn't measured. It started suddenly, sharper than before, striking through the quiet like something breaking through a barrier. The rhythm was no longer controlled, no longer spaced out in those strange patterns he had grown used to. It was faster now, uneven, almost frantic, as if whoever was making it had run out of time and was trying one last time to be heard. Joseph sat up, his breath caught somewhere between confusion and fear, listening as the sound repeated again and again, louder than it had ever been, echoing through the wall that separated his home from Sylvia Carter's. There was something different in it that night, something that made it impossible to dismiss as anything ordinary. It didn't feel like noise anymore. It felt urgent, like a warning that had been building over days, now breaking through all at once. Joseph swung his legs off the bed, standing there in the dark, his body tense, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to name. For a brief moment, he considered walking next door, knocking on Sylvia Carter's door, asking if everything was all right. But something held him back, something he couldn't explain, a hesitation that would stay with him long after that night was over. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Not gradually, not fading into the background, but completely, like it had been cut off mid-motion. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it, filling the space in a way that made the absence of sound feel louder than the noise itself. Joseph stood there for several seconds, waiting for it to return, telling himself it would start again like it always did, that this moment would pass and everything would go back to how it had been. But it didn't. The house next door remained still, the silence unbroken, stretching out longer than it ever had before. Eventually, he returned to bed, though sleep never truly came, his mind replaying what he had heard, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince himself that it wasn't what it sounded like. But deep down, there was a growing awareness that something had changed, something final. And by morning, that feeling would no longer be something he could ignore. Because when the sun rose over that quiet street, and the routines of everyday life began again, one thing was immediately clear. Sylvia Carter was gone. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. Nothing missing except her. That was the first conclusion the investigators reached as they moved carefully through Sylvia Carter's home, documenting everything, searching for anything that didn't belong, anything that could explain how someone could simply disappear without leaving a trace behind. The front door was intact, windows locked from the inside, furniture undisturbed, as if the house had been frozen in time the moment she vanished. Even the smallest details seemed untouched, a cup left on the counter, a chair slightly pulled back, everyday signs of life that made her absence feel even more unsettling. It didn't look like a place where something violent had happened, and yet the silence inside those walls suggested otherwise, a quiet that felt heavier the longer they stayed. Joseph Walker watched from a distance at first, standing just beyond the edge of the activity, his eyes fixed on the house as officers moved in and out, their presence breaking the calm that had defined that street for years. He could feel the weight of what he knew pressing against him, the memory of those nights replaying in his mind, each sound now carrying more meaning than it had before. When they finally approached him, asking if he had seen or heard anything unusual, there was a brief moment where he hesitated, not because he wanted to hide anything, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he couldn't take back. And then he told them about the timing, about the pattern, about how it had changed that last night. As he spoke, the investigators listened more closely, their attention sharpening, because suddenly, this wasn't just a disappearance without clues. It was a timeline. And that sound Joseph had been hearing might have been the only warning Sylvia Carter ever managed to give. They checked beneath the house. At first, it was just procedure, another step in a case that didn't make sense, a place to look when everything else had come up empty. But the moment the floorboards started to come up, the atmosphere shifted. What had felt like a routine search began to carry a different weight, something heavier, something that made even the most experienced officers slow down and pay closer attention. There, beneath Sylvia Carter's home, hidden in a space no one would ever think to check unless they were looking for something specific, they found it. Not an object, not something misplaced, but the answer to a question that had been echoing since the very beginning. The source of the sound wasn't outside. It wasn't the pipes, or the wind, or anything that could be explained away by the ordinary. It had been coming from inside the walls, from beneath the floor, trapped in a space where sound could travel, but escape was almost impossible. And suddenly, everything Joseph Walker had heard took on a new meaning. The pattern, the repetition, the urgency of that final night. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been meaningless. It had been deliberate. A signal. A desperate attempt to be noticed by the only person close enough to hear it. As the realization settled in, the silence that followed felt different now, no longer empty, but filled with the understanding that those sounds had never been just noise. They had been a voice, reaching out in the only way it could, hoping someone would understand before it was too late. And the most disturbing part? It wasn't what they found beneath Sylvia Carter's house, or how long it had been hidden there, or even the realization of where those sounds had truly been coming from. It was the timeline, the quiet sequence of nights that now meant something entirely different. Because when investigators matched Joseph Walker's account with what they uncovered, a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. The sounds hadn't started that final night. They hadn't even started the night before. They had been happening over and over again, at the same exact time, stretching back across multiple nights, each one carrying the same faint rhythm that Joseph had tried so hard to explain away. He stood there as the truth settled in, replaying every moment in his mind. Every night he had woken up, listened, hesitated, and chosen to wait just a little longer before doing anything about it. What once felt uncertain now felt painfully clear. Each sound no longer a mystery, but a message he had come so close to understanding too late. And in that stillness, as the street returned to the same quiet it had always known, one thought remained, heavier than anything else. He hadn't just heard it once. He hadn't imagined it. He had been hearing it for days. What would you have done if you were in Joseph Walker's position, waking up night after night at exactly 2:17 a.m., hearing something you couldn't fully explain but couldn't completely ignore either, something that didn't feel right but also didn't give you enough certainty to act without doubt creeping in? Would you have trusted that instinct, made the call, risked being wrong, or would you have done the same thing he did, telling yourself it was nothing, waiting for one more night, one more sign, one more reason to be sure? And now that you know what those sounds meant for Sylvia Carter, now that you understand what was really happening just beyond that wall, the question becomes even harder to answer. So tell me honestly, would you have called sooner, or would you have ignored it too?